welcome everyone to our fifth installment of this inter-season Dusty Tome release schedule. Hope that you guys have been enjoying the story of Devil's Den, and this week we actually conclude the story of Devil's Den. I hope that it's a good conclusion that you guys enjoy. If you have liked the Dusty Tome episodes that we've been releasing to the public, you might consider becoming a patron of the show. You get a brand new episode of the Dusty Tome each week. We try to put a ton of work into it, give it a lot of value, partly to show how grateful we are to our patrons, but also partly because this is stuff that we're still really interested in. And so we want to do a good job and be interested in it with you. Show's not possible without all you listeners, and it's not possible without our patrons. It's also not possible without our sponsors. And so this episode is brought to you by Indigo Sundry Soap, Backwards Planning Financial, New Dominion Design Co., Grey Toad Tallow, and Squirrely Joe's Coffee. Very grateful to them. Check out the sponsors if you are in need of any of those products or services. Now, like I said, this is the last episode of the Devil's Den series. Next week, we're going to be releasing some other episode of the Dusty Tome that I have not picked out yet. Patrons, if you have any input, shoot me a message on Patreon and let me know. But with that, please everyone sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. In any personal story, an interested party must seek to divide truth from fiction cleanly, with as little muscle kept on to the fat as is possible. This story of Terry Lovelace is certainly no exception to that rule, but I believe I wouldn't be considered crazy for thinking that the rule appears, on the surface at least, to be especially difficult to follow in this story. But difficult rules still require one's adherence. Thus, let us begin our analysis of Terry Lovelace's story by establishing a number of parameters for investigation. First, it's necessary to split the major discrete parts of the story into different categories. These categories are hard evidence, things that are verifiable, hearsay, otherwise known as eyewitness testimony, but from just a single individual, and a category I will be referring to as simply information, things that don't necessarily fall into the first two categories cleanly, like, for example, memories gathered via hypnotic regression. Now, upon hearing these categories, one may be overquick to establish a hierarchy of weight attributed to the parts of each story funneled in to each category. What I mean is that we'll probably all be tempted to consider hard evidence as the most important variables, while hearsay and information will likely follow on the rank of importance in descending order. However, I don't think this is necessarily the right instinct, for reasons that will hopefully become clear shortly. But in case they don't magically become clear to everyone, you know what they say about assuming things, I will provide an example for why presently. One of the pieces of hard evidence would be Terry's undeniable service record in the United States Air Force. The fact is, even if all else in the world fails, one can still be certain that the man named Terry Lovelace did in fact serve in the Air Force and was stationed at Fort Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. While this is true, one of the pieces of hearsay is that while there, he underwent hypnotic regression at the hands of some eccentric OSI officers who by necessity were working a bit more off the public record. We don't actually know if the hypnotic regression happened in the same way that we know of Terry's enlistment in the Air Force. Now, some may be tempted to think that the Air Force service is therefore more important to determine the overall provenance of the story, simply by nature of it being a verifiable aspect of it. But this is clearly faulty thinking. Reason being, Terry's service in the Air Force is only tangentially related to the overall series of events that we've become acquainted with over the previous weeks. What is far more important on the scales of discernment in this particular example is this, and it is a two-parter. Do we have reason to trust Terry enough to suspend disbelief and hear him out? And then secondly, is what he is saying objectively impossible, given what we know about the nature of the world? My hope is that these questions help us all see the way in which I believe this analysis must be approached. Use the verifiable information of Terry's Air Force service to confirm the first question. In other words, I do believe that we have enough reason to trust Terry as a witness, enough at least to hear him out. and then use the hearsay and miscellaneous information he gives us to help in answering the second question. In this way, each category of information finds its proper lane in which it might flourish. Hopefully, all of this means that our analysis can, however humble it is, be somewhat productive. I'm sure I could have said all of that more succinctly, but we all know the drill here at Haunted Cosmos. Bottom line, let us not tire ourselves with constantly questioning the validity of Terry's witness. Instead, let us accept his witness insofar as it ought to be accepted, and focus our interrogation on the veracity of his actual claims rather than on the man who is claiming them. So long as this underlying principle of engagement remains appropriate, I think it will yield the better fruit. Given that, let us begin by quickly rattling off the hard evidence so that it can serve as a foundation of a witness that is relatively trustworthy. From there, we can dive into the story as Terry would have remembered it without any hypnosis before throwing that final monkey wrench into the equation. So, as stated, we know that Terry Lovelace served in the Air Force out of Whitman Air Force Base. We know Terry served as an EMT on the base hospital. We know Terry was married at the time of his service in Whitman. We know he went camping with his friend Toby at Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas. We know he returned both early and quite ill, which required him to be checked into the urgent care on base. We know he became a lawyer for the State Department, even going so far as to serve as the Assistant Attorney General of the U.S. Samoa Territory. We know he received x-rays from a doctor that he was told revealed anomalous and foreign objects embedded in both of his knees. These objects, according to the doctor, appeared to be electronic. We know that later x-rays showed the objects as having been removed, leaving only a small sliver of wiring behind. The taking of these objects coincided with inexplicable bruising on Terry's thighs and small puncture wounds that were no larger than a spider bite. Lastly, we know that Terry Lovelace lost weight at incredible rates in his later years. The man, who formerly weighed 240 pounds, inexplicably began to lose weight until he could barely keep himself over 150. He lives today and still tries to maintain some form of a healthy weight, but he struggles. These are all pieces of important information that we know with certainty are true. We don't rely on a single choke point of witness to inform us. Others weigh in with documentation to prove these things out. Given all these things, let us walk through the series of events as told by Terry, assuming no hypnotic regression had ever occurred. In short, what did he recall on his own? To begin, we have to reckon with the childhood experiences of nightmares. Listeners will remember from episode 1 of this Dusty Tome series that Terry was plagued by visions in the night of humanoids wearing the faces of smiling monkeys, standing around his bed, trying to coax him into going away with them. What first may seem like a particularly horrific trend of sleep paralysis in the boy is actually something else. Note that in these experiences, Terry is able to speak to the creatures, and he's also able to move himself to a fetal-type position near his headboard. But before we go saying that it must have all been vivid dreams, remember that Terry wholeheartedly believed them to be really happening. None of it took place in some dramatized version of his bedroom or in some black chasm of hell where there was just he, the monkey men, his bed, and a light shining down from above to illumine the whole scene. No, Terry was sure all of it was really playing out before him as he was fully lucid and awake. To be fair, he has reason to be so convinced of this. After all, in the earliest story, relating how he woke his whole family from sleep because of his screaming, he claims that he remembers how his scream did not wake himself up, only everyone else. He was already awake, so far as he can recall. Assuming the validity of his witness, which the hard evidence allows us to do with relative confidence, this should cause us to conclude that one of two things were happening in regards to the monkey man visions. One, it was all real as Terry states it, and he was really being propositioned by living entities to come away with them for the night. Or two, he imagined it all in some kind of waking nightmare or deeply realistic hallucination. For the sake of interest, let us assume it to be the former. In that case, something worthy of our attention is the insistence of the beings to get Terry's approval before stealing him away for the night. This should obviously remind one of the black-eyed kids' need to be invited in, as well as the story of Marcella and the Mothman that implies some kind of need on the Mothman's part to be invited into the home of a victim. In deeper folklore that seems more credible to us because of its age, which is not a ridiculous notion, the vampire is well known to require an invitation before fully overtaking the residence of someone. This is not true in all vampiric folklore, but it is in some. The reason this detail is always striking to me, no matter what type of event, haunting, abduction, or otherwise I'm researching, is because it's clearly not the case for all entities or events. Sasquatch seems perfectly capable of terrorizing whomever he wishes. Ghosts seem to be free to haunt whatever place or person. Many others, supposedly abducted by aliens, never once have an opportunity to give their consent, at least not that they can recall. But if we continue to beg the whole question in the first place, is this not akin to the story of Job in some ways? Perhaps all of these events, if spiritual, are reflecting a rule we see an example of in the pages of Scripture. The beings are merely doing all that they have been given leave to do. But anyways, back to the narrative. The next component comes in the form of Terry seeing 2 UFOs as a child. Both of these sightings take place at his house, one in the front yard and one in the back. In the first sighting, which took place in the backyard, Terry was playing a game in broad daylight when he was essentially put into what he described as a trance for an indeterminate amount of time while he stared at the flying saucer. This would mean that Terry being asleep is not a required prerequisite for abduction activity to take place. In the second instance, Terry woke up from his bed, especially drowsy, and saw the flying saucer hovering inches away from his house and over the front lawn. Now, in the first case, Terry suddenly became frantically excited, bordering on manic, while the subtext also indicates that he felt some sense of terror when he finally snapped out of his trance. In the second case, he felt only apathy as he shrugged off the amazing sight before him and slowly drug his feet back to bed while the flying saucer was just still outside of his room. It almost seems as though the entities were learning how to best ensure Terry would either not care about the sightings, or if he did, would only care about them in a way that elicited positive excitement. Moving on, one cannot fail to remember that in the midmost of these UFO sightings, some more abstract things began to afflict the boy. He started having bad dreams that he fully admitted to believing were dreams and nothing more, of being operated on and tortured by something that appeared to be a large mantis-like insect that was intelligent. Additionally, he started being deathly afraid of the dark, especially the dark of nighttime. And something I believe I failed to mention until now, he started to fear his neighbor, who was a small Asian woman. Note the general shape of the eyes. This ends the selection of experiences that Toby remembers on his own power from childhood. Moving on to his adulthood, we come to his recollection of events from Devil's Den, unaided by the fickle hypnosis. At the risk of being too repetitive, I will not retell the entire story point by point in some dramatized fashion like I did in episode 1. Instead, I will distill the most relevant details down for our consideration, so as not to be lost in the noise of the narrative. After all, when investigating, one must systematize, something that I am usually loath to do. The first noteworthy thing is that neither Terry nor Toby were interested in anything outdoorsy, with the minor exceptions of Terry's photography and Toby's love of stargazing. These men were not campers. Indeed, according to Terry, neither of them had ever been camping before their fateful trip. Despite these things, though, they both quickly became obsessed with the trip. Their obsession presumably led them to disregard every reasonable option for a first camping trip. Instead of staying local, they were enamored with Devil's Den from the start, despite having never visited the park. Instead of camping in the frequented areas, they desired deep wilderness. Instead of the still marked sites that afforded one solitude and a sense of being in the wild, they opted to find an unmarked place to camp that was far removed from any marked areas of the park. Lastly, and this is very important, instead of getting any information at all from the ranger station, they bypassed the entrance to the park itself and basically broke into a restricted area. Why? There are far easier ways to get a more rugged and wild camping experience than trespassing on state property. And note the apparent absent-mindedness with which they approached it all, despite the trip being their sole focus and thought for weeks leading up. Terry forgot his camera, the initial catalyst for his agreeing to Toby's harebrained idea in the first place. All of this leads us to the first hours after their arrival to the park. Instead of diligently setting up camp first, something they both knew they should have done, they went for a quick hike in the trail-free woods across the meadow. I cannot emphasize enough how eerie this section of Terry's story reads to one with fresh eyes. They go on this hike, stop to rest on a sloping rock face that's part of a larger hill, and just immediately fall asleep. This would only be slightly strange if not for the description of Terry's mindset upon waking. They both were in a near panic to get back to the meadow as soon as they could to set up camp. It was also frantic and weird. One gets the clear sense that Terry was not comfortable with the nap he took on that rock. Let me be clear, he was not only not comfortable with the rush it set them in once they woke up. No, he wasn't comfortable with the nature of the nap itself. At any rate, they did eventually make it back to camp, only to klutz their way through setting it up, collecting firewood with no axe, pitching the tent with no prior practice, making dinner with a slipshod hodgepodge of food and warm beer. Normally, all of these factors would yield a hilariously unforgettable experience between friends that only serves to bring them closer together. But in reading Terry's account of things, one cannot escape the sense that all of this was stressful then and remained a stressful memory forevermore. One cannot escape the sense that even then, the wedge was being driven between them by forces outside of and even above themselves. But the indomitable human spirit remained in each man still. And so for a time before their initial sighting of the spinning lights, they were able to enjoy a couple hours of something that felt like peace and joy and rest in the world. As we know, though, all of that was soon to change. The lights appeared on the horizon. They spun around each other as they rose and drifted silently through the sky, like a watching judge from space that looks with unfeeling discernment down upon the affairs of men, a false god in a false heaven. The men grew apathetic, but still interested enough to observe the fullness of the craft's approach, until it lingered over their meadow like an oppressive but silent monster from the pit of Lovecraft's minds. At that, and at the careless behest of Toby, the men went into the tent and fell asleep. The next thing Terry remembers is the brutal scene of waking up sometime in the night, completely sore, in terrible pain, while he watched his best friend sob to himself as he sat on his knees looking out the tent's window, with his face lit up by a pale light that was too artificial to be the moon. He watched tall shadows approach the craft with smaller figures at their sides before they all disappeared, and it was then that Toby uttered those infamous words, "They heard us." Upon reflection, even if no alleged light had been shed on that night by the hypnotic regression, it still remains one of the craziest stories I have ever heard, one that even on its own would warrant hours of consideration. After this, the saga of Terry's fight with OSI, his saying goodbye to Toby, who had already bore the air of a walking dead man within days after the event, and the eventual hypnosis at the hands of the enigmatic Brad, presents itself to us in quick succession. We will forego discussing these things in order to keep our understanding of Terry's unsupplemented memories untarnished. It's worth noting, however, that what follows took place after Terry's hypnosis. Despite the questionable veracity of the practice, which we will get into, it did serve to mark a turning point in Terry's life, an outlook on the whole ordeal, and thus ought to be recognized by all of us. With that, the next event worth our attention is that of Terry's strange motorcycle ride detour. If you will recall, he was engaged in his regular Saturday morning ride on a route he had traveled dozens of times before, when he suddenly started, as if from a trance, to find himself traveling down a gravel road that forked off the main route. He had no memory of how he had gotten there, and initially took it to be an extreme case of highway hypnosis. When he arrived home, the truth of how long he had been blacked out came to light, and Terry was startled. On that same day, he conversed with his wife about his recent fears of mannequins in clothing stores. Note the overall shape of the body and face, or lack thereof. He also learned of an experience his wife had recently had in the middle of the night the week prior, wherein she woke to see a strange, womanly-type being standing between their bed and their bedroom window. She felt for Terry to her side, only to find that he was not there before she was told, via telepathy, by the woman to remain calm and go back to sleep, which she then did. In the midst of these events and those that follow, Terry also received a routine X-ray that revealed an anomalous object in his leg, followed by more X-rays in the future, after waking to inexplicable bruising on both of his thighs, which showed the objects mysteriously gone with little remaining trace. The last piece of the puzzle, which again took place long after OSI's hypnosis, was another nighttime adventure that has hitherto been untold. One night, after Terry had fallen fast asleep in his bed, he suddenly woke, sitting straight up on the couch in his living room. He had never been a sleepwalker before, but he initially presumed this to have occurred to him. Soon, though, he discovered the truth. Whether waking or dreaming, he did not know, but his awareness, lucidity, and latter recollection left him convinced that it was the former. He observed the small, uncanny woman sitting across from him on the opposite chair. She was short, wearing a wig, had 4 long fingers on either hand, and held large and slanted eyes on her face. He remembered thinking of the men in black stories from other UFO encounters, and immediately figured her for one of them. However, strangely, he also sensed that he had somehow seen this woman many times before in his life. They spoke telepathically and like old friends, which quickly confirmed Terry's suspicion of knowing her. She cautioned him not to write the book he wrote. She informed him that her hosts, as she kept calling them, would come to take the devices from his legs. She comforted his fear by promising that he would never be taken or experimented on ever again. And for all intents and purposes, that was it. That's the end of the story. Now, it's worth taking a brief moment to discuss why I have assumed such an air of suspicion and even outright rejection towards hypnosis and Terry's experience of hypnotic regression. Hypnosis has been around for much of human history, and while it is generally considered today to be a sort of brain trick pulled off on people by mentalists or administered to women suffering menopause by competent therapists, its roots are actually found in much more sinister soil. The fundamental characteristic of hypnosis is the induction of a person into a sort of trance-like state. To be sure, the official definition of hypnosis is that it consists of a human condition involving focused attention and inattention, reduced peripheral awareness, and an enhanced capacity to respond to suggestion. These things require a sort of temporary vacation from the natural state of man's mind in favor of sojourning in a place partway removed from reality. Hence, hypnosis requires a trance. For thousands of years, Eastern religions have praised the art of trance states in meditation and have encouraged monks and other esteemed practitioners of mystic worship to learn the art of entering into trances. However, in 1027, the Persian psychologist and physician Avicenna finally published a scholarly work outlining the difference between official trance, or hypnosis, and normal human sleep. In the trance, lucidity is maintained to enough of a degree to ensure you're still getting the full but ultra-focused thoughts of the subject. Avicenna published the widespread belief that one could induce the condition in another person so long as that other person accepted the reality and invitation of the hypnotic treatment. As Hermetic and esoteric doctrine began to worm its leaven into the Western mind via, for example, the works attributed to Christian Rosencreuz, which was discussed in our series on esoterica some months back, hypnotism became a natural evolution of existing practices, like using magnets in medical treatments or seeking to tap into the life force of creation in order to right ailments in people, something called animal magnetism. In this fertile bed of mystic mixture of Western Christian thinking, hypnosis found a great opportunity to flourish in its migration from the East. As time wore on, the practices continued, and the crowds that the practice ran in started to show more and more of their true colors. For example, most modern Western hypnotists were also signatories to the first declarations that began the bloody and godless French Revolution, a horrible rebellion of man against God and righteousness that cost the lives of hundreds of thousands needlessly. Finally, though, the practice of hypnotism became more widespread when a Catholic priest hailing from, you guessed it, India, named Abba Faria, started using the dark art on willing participants within his parish. From the East came a temptation to syncretize that proved for some too great a temptation. I could go on with the history of the practice itself, but perhaps that is for another day. I believe I've gone far enough to make the point I desire to clearly. I do not, for a single second, trust hypnosis. To me, from the little research that I've done, its origins are not hidden by any means. It's clear that hypnosis is at best a foolish and unnecessary practice adopted by the Christian West from the poor influence of the pagan East, and is at worst a twisting of nature to achieve ends contrary to it, something evil, though it remains elusive to judge explicitly. For these reasons, and partly due to my own sensibilities that demand me to think of hypnosis as much closer to the downright wicked side of the foolish to sinful spectrum, I think that memories brought back from the depths of forgetfulness from hypnotic regression are absolutely unreliable. Perhaps they're based in something real, that I would accept, but the manipulation of nature never yields the fruit of righteousness. Therefore, I reject all of its fruit altogether as nothing more than tricky, misleading, corrupted, and probably deceptive. For these reasons, though again I accept the potentiality of a truthful root to Terry's recovered memories, I ultimately consider them unhelpful and at best historical fiction. I consider them to be possibly given to Terry as corrupted memories to further deceive both him and others, a poisonous olive branch offered by some evil intelligence that has its fingers crossed behind its back. And therefore we come to the final word, or my own final word, which remains to be spoken on the whole thing. I must admit my feelings are mixed. While I'm prone to lend Terry the benefit of the doubt for the events that he remembers on his own and that were not fueled by the hypnosis, I dare say that the fact that he relies so heavily upon the hypnosis gives me pause. It appears to be a serious crutch to him that helps him to formulate much of his opinions on what exactly happened to him throughout his life. Here's the thing. If you use evil to relearn your own memories and experiences, it is likely that the evil will taint those recollections, multiplying sin with yet more sin. And I don't say that to imply that Terry's forgotten memories should actually give us all the warm and fuzzies, and that only that pesky hypnotic regression turned them bad. Rather, I'm arguing the likelihood that the sinfulness of the hypnotic regression turned any recollected memories into useless and unreliable data points, not worthy of much weight or consideration. They are exciting, sure, and they are, and I don't doubt that he really does believe that he saw everything that he said he saw while under the hypnosis. But seeing a thing doesn't make it true. The seed of knowledge and reliability for man must come from something other than and outside of himself and his forgotten memories that have been drudged up to the surface by sinful or foolish methodology. Having said all of that, my inclination is to admit that I am quite compelled by the foundation of Terry's story into saying that he very well could have been repeatedly abducted by demons, experimented on and tortured, and maybe even abused in far less savory senses to help the demons attempt to propagate some kind of hybridized demon breed of a thing. My reason for this is simple. It's what the demons do. They hate God, and therefore they hate his image everywhere they see it. That means they hate you and me and everyone else. In answer to the question of why they would care so much about human anatomy and reproduction, I would answer that those who ask that should read Genesis 3. In that chapter, as God is doling out the curses to the offending parties of creation, man, woman, and then the serpent, he informs the ancient serpent, the devil, of the entirety of his plan to fix everything. What does God say? He says that the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head, and the serpent will bruise his heel. That is the first messianic promise in Scripture, the first gracious and certain hope given to man from God of his eventual salvation from sin and death. And God makes sure that the serpent, the arch-enemy, hears the whole thing. Thus, Genesis 6:4 ensues not just from fallen angelic lust, but also from a desire to thwart God's plan. If the redemption for man will come from the seed of the woman, what better way to kill the validity of that plan than by infecting the lineage of man with demonic seed? And thus God's glorious decree is revealed for the beautiful thing that it is, and not only his utter destruction of those mixed-race Nephilimic monsters via the flood and Israel's conquest of Canaan, but also in his own usurping of nature's order, an order which he himself created, to conceive the God-man by the Holy Spirit in the womb of the Virgin Mary. Does not our Lord write the best stories?